5 of the 6 most valuable companies in the world are American, yet just over 2 centuries ago, the United States was a country with a tiny population, even smaller than Ireland. What has happened since then is remarkable, and I'm going to explain why. On March 1st, I compiled a list of the 20 largest companies in the world by market value. Many of these names will be familiar to you. Apple led the list with over $2 trillion, and the 20th company was worth around $330 billion. Analyzing that list, we see Apple at the top, accompanied by 5 other American companies. The first non-American company to appear is Saudi Aramco, an entity that could almost be considered a country's representation in the corporate world, given that a significant portion, possibly 95%, of its shares belong to the Saudi government. In essence, it's as if the country itself were for sale through this business. What's striking is that among the top 6 companies globally, 5 are of American origin, reflecting the dominance these firms hold in the global economy. When you hear people say the United States isn't performing well, remember that worldwide, 5 of the top 6 most valuable companies are based in the U.S. And if you think about it, in 1790, we had just 0.5% of the world's population, a bit less than 4 million people, 3.9 million to be precise, with 600,000 of them enslaved. Ireland had a larger population than the U.S. back then. Russia had 5 times as many people, and Ukraine had twice as many. But what did we have? We had a map for the future, an aspirational blueprint that, 232 years after the Constitution, has left us with 5 of the world's 6 largest companies. This is no accident, and it's not because we were smarter or stronger. We had good soil and decent weather. But so did some of those other countries I mentioned. The system has worked incredibly well. We should do a mental exercise. I'd like you to look at that list for a minute or two, and then estimate how many of those companies you think will still be on it 30 years from now. These are powerhouse firms. How many will remain? We know it won't be all 20. It might not even be any of them. Now, I invite you to look at slide 2, which goes back just over 30 years to the top 20 companies of 1989. If you examine that list, 2 things should stand out. None of the top 20 from 30 years ago are on today's list. 0. Back then, there were 6 American companies on the list, names you'd recognize, like General Electric and IBM. These companies still exist today, but none made it back onto the top 20 list 3 decades later. 0. And I doubt many of you, when I asked you to participate in the quiz earlier, would have guessed 0. I don't think it'll be 0 this time, but a reminder of how dramatically things can change. Japan had enjoyed a wonderful bull market for a long time, so several Japanese companies were on the list back then. Today, there are none. The U.S. had 6 in 1989. Now we have 13, but they're not the same 6. 1989 wasn't the Middle Ages. We weren't just discovering capitalism. People thought they knew a lot about the stock market. The efficient market theory was in vogue. It wasn't a backward era. The largest company at the time had a market value of $100 billion, $104 billion, to be exact. So, in just over 30 years, the title of the world's biggest company has gone from $100 billion to $2 trillion. At the bottom of the list, the 20th company has gone from $34 billion to something a little over 10 times that. This tells us something about inequality, which is a hot topic in the world, and a bit about inflation, though this wasn't a highly inflationary period overall. But what it really says is that capitalism has worked incredibly well, especially for capitalists. It's a pretty astonishing number. Could it happen again that in 30 years, a company multiplies Apple's value by 30 and leads a market? It seems impossible, but history has already shown us that the world can change in unexpected and dramatic ways. Are we as confident today as Wall Street was in 1989? It's worth reflecting on. Let me offer another example to ponder when you start feeling overly confident in your investing abilities. This case, by the way, makes a powerful argument for index funds. The key to long-term investment success wasn't necessarily identifying exactly which specific company would succeed, but simply ensuring you were participating in the market. It was like boarding a ship heading toward prosperity. All these ships, these companies, were sailing toward a promised land of greater value, and while it was beneficial to choose the right ship, what truly mattered was being on board. Even if you didn't pick the absolute best, simply holding a diversified portfolio of stocks would yield excellent results. In my personal opinion, U.S. stocks will be the best choice for this approach. The strategy was to hold these investments for a long period, about 30 years, allowing compound growth and the overall expansion of the market to work in your favor. This example demonstrates why index funds are so effective. They let you participate in the market's growth as a whole without needing to predict which specific companies will dominate in the future, a task that has proven extraordinarily difficult even for the most experienced investors. But if you thought you knew a lot about which companies to pick, or if the person you hired, the one you paid a lot of money, had all these ideas, I can tell you that their best ideas in 1989 didn't necessarily work out so well. Yet, they still delivered great returns because of the sustained growth of the markets. People are powerfully drawn to trendy industries. There's a tendency where investors get excessively excited about specific sectors generating buzz at any given moment. When a company simply announces it operates in that popular industry, it immediately gains special appeal. This phenomenon allows these firms to launch initial public offerings, IPOs, or use special purpose acquisition companies, SPACs, to raise capital with ease. The troubling part is that amid this euphoria, investors often overlook fundamental metrics that truly matter: real sales numbers, concrete profit figures, and other basic financial indicators. Rational logic is temporarily suspended, replaced by simplistic reasoning based on the idea that you must invest in that sector simply because it's the place to be right now. This herd behavior has triggered bubbles numerous times throughout financial history, and rarely ends well for those who arrive late to the party. So let me ask you, what was the place to be in 1903? My father was born in 1903. Not big news. But what was significant was that Henry Ford was starting the Ford Motor Company. He had failed a couple of times before, but was about to change the world. The automobile transformed the country. We have a great auto insurance company. If there were no cars, there'd be no Geico. Ford introduced a $5 daily wage, which was huge, along with assembly lines and everything else. Cars arrived. Suppose you had glimpsed in 1903 all the interstate highways, the 290 million vehicles on U.S. roads. Everything pointed to cars being the right investment. We own a company called Marmon, which we bought from the Pritzker family some years ago. The Pritzkers had built this business from many, many acquisitions. The name of their company was Marmon. I don't know exactly why Jay and Bob decided to call it that, but they own a company that, in 1911, had produced a car that won the first Indianapolis 500. Maybe that's why they named it Marmon. They were proud of that fact. Marmon was also responsible for inventing the rear-view mirror, though I'm not entirely convinced this was an extraordinary contribution to society. It's the kind of invention you wouldn't want to highlight too much as a great achievement, especially in a domestic setting. The story behind this invention is quite curious and pragmatic. During Marmon's participation in the Indianapolis 500, they had a system where a person typically sat next to the driver, tasked with looking back to monitor competitors' positions and report to the pilot. On one occasion, this assistant was sick and couldn't perform his duty. Faced with this unforeseen situation, as an improvised but ingenious solution, they developed and installed the rear-view mirror. What began as a fix for a very specific problem in racing ended up becoming a standard feature in all modern cars. It's a fascinating example of how innovations sometimes arise from immediate needs and end up having much broader applications than originally intended. Suppose you decided that automobiles were this incredible thing, that someday there'd be an Indy 500, someday there'd be rear-view mirrors in cars, and someday 290 million cars would be cruising across the U.S. I decided to look at history and thought about showing the list of automotive companies over the years. Originally, I was going to show only those starting with M to fit them on a slide, but when I got to the MS, the list kept going and going. So I decided to show only those starting with Ma. As you can see, there were nearly 40 companies that entered the auto business just starting with Ma, including our little Marmon there in the middle column, which lasted quite a while. They were still selling cars in the 1930s, which were really quite special. In any case, there were at least 2,000 companies that entered the auto business because it clearly had this incredible future. And of course, remember that by 2009, only 3 remained, 2 of which went bankrupt. There's much more to stock picking than figuring out which industry is going to be wonderful in the future. The Mack Company made a car. DuPont made a car. There was a Nebraska Motor Company. They all started auto businesses, just like everyone's starting something now that they can get people's money for. But very, very few people chose a winner. You couldn't invest in Ford Motor early on. Henry Ford had some partners he didn't really like, so he found a way to buy them out. That was sort of the beginning of auto financing. It's a long story, but we won't get into it. You could buy Ford Motor, and of course, General Motors eventually became the dominant company. Henry Ford didn't really transition well from the Model T to the Model A. I want to share a valuable piece of advice for those starting out in investing. Someone asked me if I could guarantee a 50% annual return if I had to start over with less than $1 million. Excellent question, and I'm glad they asked. In my particular case, the answer would lie in exhaustive dedication, immersing myself in roughly 20,000 pages of financial information. For example, when I was interested in railroads, I meticulously reviewed Moody's Transportation Manual multiple times. This document contained between 1,500 and 2,000 pages, and by studying it when I was just 20 or 21, I discovered countless fascinating opportunities that went unnoticed by other investors. Probably no one here knows the Green Bay and Western Railroad Company, but back then, there were hundreds of railroad firms, and I enjoyed researching each one in depth. At the time, all railroad companies had distinct nicknames. Northern Pacific was Nipper. Snow operated in the east up to Cornell, and Green Bay and Western had the curious nickname Grab Baggage and Weight. The latter had an interesting financial quirk. They issued bonds that functioned like common stock and common stock that operated like bonds. These financial anomalies represented exceptional opportunities for small portfolios, though they wouldn't be practical if you were managing millions of dollars. My strategy was to identify and capitalize on many of these special situations. In fact, it was precisely this detailed knowledge that impressed Charlie Munger when we first met. He was surprised because I had in-depth information about small West Coast companies he believed were unknown to almost everyone. For example, I knew details about the Los Angeles Athletic Club, which immediately created a bond between us. Today, I wouldn't know what the modern equivalent of Moody's manuals would be. My recommendation would be to acquire deep knowledge about small, underanalyzed companies. With $1 million, you could indeed achieve a 50% annual return, but there's a fundamental condition. You must genuinely fall in love with the research process. It's not enough to love the money. You need to be passionate about the hunt itself, much like how others are passionate about their respective fields. True success comes from finding joy in the very act of discovering these opportunities. A biologist immerses themselves in research driven by an intrinsic desire for discovery. This motivation seems deeply ingrained in their nature. While I don't fully understand the mechanisms of the human brain, and honestly, I don't think anyone truly does, I've observed that there are different types of people who experience genuine, exhilarating excitement when expanding their knowledge in specific fields. Throughout my life, I've had the privilege of meeting bridge masters and chess virtuosos. I've built relationships with numerous individuals who demonstrate extraordinary intelligence in their areas of expertise, but who, paradoxically, can behave with surprising clumsiness when venturing outside those domains. This observation has led me to a fundamental conclusion. The human brain is an incredibly complex system that performs at its peak when we identify what it's especially wired for. The real secret to cognitive success lies in discovering what your brain is naturally prepared to do and then dedicating yourself intensely to developing that inclination to its fullest extent. This specialization allows us to make the most of our innate abilities, channeling our energy toward activities where we can achieve exceptional results. It's fascinating how certain individuals can exhibit almost superhuman skills in specific areas, while showing surprising limitations in others that seem simpler. This duality underscores the importance of finding our own cognitive niche and developing it with passion and dedication. That's what I'd be doing if I had a small amount of money and wanted to earn 50% a year. But I'd also simply want to play the game. And you can't do it if you don't truly find a game interesting, whether it's bridge, chess, or, in this case, finding undervalued stocks. It seems to me you're on the right track. Anyone who comes to this annual meeting has something on their mind besides bridge or chess, so I'm glad you came. Come back next year. I think Berkshire is a good investment to hold, but for an individual like my wife, I believe the best approach is to invest 90% in an index fund, with only a small fraction in active investments. She'll have more than enough to live very comfortably for the rest of her life. Personally, I'd rather hold Berkshire than invest in the general market. I'm comfortable with this decision because I believe our businesses are better than the market average, though things fluctuate constantly. Over the long term, I'd bet on Berkshire over the broader market. That said, I've never recommended that anyone buy Berkshire stock because I don't want people investing based on my financial advice. Instead, I've recommended S&P 500 index funds for an incredibly long time. I've publicly stated that after my death, the fund for my widow will consist of 90% in an S&P 500 index fund and 10% in treasury bonds. Tariffs are often sold as a tool to protect the local economy, boost domestic industry, and create jobs. But the real question we should ask is, and then what? History has shown us that economic decisions rarely have isolated effects. When a country imposes trade barriers, it doesn't just affect the price of imported goods. It triggers a chain of reactions that can reshape the global economy for decades. What seems like a simple solution today to protect certain industries might tomorrow become a trap that slows growth, raises the cost of living, and sparks international trade tensions. The consequences of these decisions aren't always obvious at first glance, but understanding them is key to anticipating where the world is headed. Because in the end, economics is a game of cause and effect, and whatever goes up must eventually come down.